G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Continuing with Australia's greatest day of shame, which comes from Darwin 1942, officially titled Australia's Darkest Hour. But the quote comes from Sir Paul Hasluck, who was there on the day and he later became Governor-General of the country. He described February 1942 as Australia's day of greatest national shame while he was unveiling a plaque dedicated to the 243 people who were killed in the bombing raid. I'm assuming that you've already heard part 1 and part 2. Continuing on page 27. Midway between the town and the RAAF base towards East Point was the second of Darwin's aerodromes. It was the airport where on 10th of December 1919 Qantas's founder Hudson Fysh had watched Ross and Keith Smith land their Vickers Vimy to claim the £10,000 prize for the first Australians to fly from England to Australia in 28 days. In February 1942, the civil aerodrome was used by the few airliners which still came into Darwin on scheduled services to Brisbane and Adelaide, and by Dutch DC-3s which commuted between Australia and the fast diminishing remnants of the Dutch East Indies. The RAAF also kept a detachment of Wirraway trainers there, and on the day of the raid there were 5 Wirraways on the ground, all unserviceable. Bracket, the only evidence of the aerodrome today is a plaque marking the place where the Smiths Vimy touched down, close bracket. The civil aerodrome was run by the Department of Civil Aviation, and among the staff on duty on the 19th was radio operator Bruce Ackland, who kept a remarkable diary of the raid and of many of the attacks on Darwin that would follow in the coming months. Ackland was on duty that morning in the radio room, and at 9:45 by his watch he noticed what looked like a dogfight between 3 planes taking place to the south. Bracket, it was probably an American Kitty Hawk being disposed of by 2 Zeros, as the Japanese air fleet flew inland before it turned to bomb the town. Ackland pointed it out to the other operators in the room, and after watching it uneasily for a few moments, he asked the clerk to confirm with RAAF operations that even though no alarm had sounded, it was not an enemy raid. The signal was sent over the direct teleprinter, quote, "Is it all clear?" unquote, and almost immediately there came back the curious reply, quote, "All clear now," unquote. As there had never been any warning that anything was wrong in the first place, it seemed an odd choice of words. After getting the reply, Ackland was on the veranda outside the clerk's office on his way back to the radio room when he heard the drone of a large force of aircraft. He looked up and saw 3 large formations approaching from the southeast, and he called to the others to come and look. There had still been no alarm. The next second, the anti-aircraft guns opened fire, and in this way, the key staff at Darwin's Aerodrome learned that the Japanese were raiding. They raced back into the air radio room and quickly transmitted in Morse the coded warning that an air raid was in progress. Quote, QQQ, 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 followed by the station identification. Almost at once they heard the acknowledgement from Daily Orders, 500 kilometres south, which was taken up by several other stations. They cut off the electric power to the transmitters and then ran back to their quarters where they had built their air raid trenches. They passed several trenches on the way where they would have taken cover, but they were full of Air Force personnel who wouldn't let them in. As it was, they had plenty of time because the Japanese did not turn their attention to the civil airport until they had dealt with the harbour and the town. It was 10:15 before the first bombs began to fall there. Bruce Ackland, in his slip trench near the perimeter of the runway, had his first taste of a 500-pound bomb when one exploded only 75 metres away. He never imagined that an explosion could be so deafening, and he experienced a partial blackout of all his senses. And then the fighters came in almost at ground level, machine-gunning aircraft and buildings with deadly accuracy. They were so low that the Australians could see the pilots' faces. A small arms dump used by the RAAF caught fire, and 300,000 rounds of .303 ammunition began to explode. There were smaller fires everywhere, and when the fighters had disappeared, Ackland and the others ran to the aerodrome to try to put them out, but the Japanese had set the fire tender alight and they couldn't get near it. The roar from the fires was now so loud that they could hardly hear themselves speak, and a strong wind was fanning the flames towards the main administration building. The shack housing the transmitters and receivers had been hit, but the damage did not appear to be too severe. For the time being, however, they were still unusable because the power in the town had been destroyed and their emergency power supply was on fire. There was a direct line to Darwin Radio, the AWA coastal station, and Ackland was given permission by Lou Kernock to use his emergency facilities. The most urgent priority was to warn all unsuspecting civil aircraft to stay well clear of the Darwin area until further notice. For the next 5 days, all communications about civil air operations had to be sent through VID, adding yet another burden to the AWA staff, many of whom worked day and night without sleep to maintain contact with the outside world. After the raid, Bruce Ackland and 2 other DCA radio operators drove across to the RAAF base, intending to offer them the use of their transmitter if they needed it. To their astonishment, the station was deserted, and they could find nobody. They wandered unchallenged through the base until they came to the transmitter room. It should have been under close security, but instead they found the door swinging open and the room empty. The transmitter seemed to be undamaged, so they opened up a watch on an emergency frequency and stayed there the rest of the day, until, late that night, 3 RAAF wireless operators returned and took over. The RAAF watch was with the airboard in Melbourne, but this was fast becoming absurd because all incoming messages were in code and all the officers who could have decoded them had run away. By that evening there were so many signals stacked up which none of them could read that Andrew Swan agreed to go in search of one of the missing decoding officers. He had no luck, but what he did find 30 kilometres down the road at the ACH transmitting station was a code book, which he brought back carefully hidden as he had no right to it. In this way they decoded their signals and at the same time managed to keep from the airboard for one more day the truth about what had happened in Darwin that day. In the town, people reacted to the raid in many ways. Some broke down immediately, while others displayed courage they had probably never suspected they possessed. One elderly man, Alf Shepherd, veteran of the Battle of Mons in the First World War, sat unperturbed on a flight of the office steps and watched the raid as the planes swooped low over the town, machine gunning and bombing, as though he was sitting on the hill at the Sydney cricket ground. He watched without expression as a man ran for safety and threw himself on the ground centimetres ahead of a burst of machine gun fire. But his dog was fractionally too slow and was hit by the bullets and rolled over dead. Property owner Roy Edwards, who was one of the few men in the Darwin that day who had been born there, was talking to the secretary of the local Red Cross branch, and they went on chatting, watching unconcernedly as the Japanese aircraft came closer and closer. There was no alarm, and Edwards was one of the many who were saying with relief, quote, "Thank God the Yanks are here at last." And he added, "If the Japs hear of this lot, they'll think twice before attacking." Then the man he was talking to said, "What are those silver-looking things?" And the dreadful truth suddenly dawned on Edwards. He shouted, "Good God, they're Japs! Run for your life!" That's a quote. At the moment the first bomb exploded, he heard a siren begin its low wailing somewhere behind him, gradually building up to a full crescendo. Roy Edwards was one of the few people in Darwin who had not worried unduly about being trapped in Darwin. Out at the civil aerodrome, his little single-engined Puss Moth was waiting to take him and his wife to safety whenever the danger became too great. It had never occurred to him, as it had never occurred to anyone in Darwin that day, that the raid would take place without any warning. And he did not know, until later that day, that his Puss Moth was a smouldering ruin, machine-gunned out of existence by a Zero pilot. Not far away, in the police barracks in Mitchell Street, Constable Leo Law, nominative determinism yet again, had just stepped under the shower when the raid began. He knew at once what was happening and wrapped a towel around himself. He raced outside and dived into a slit trench that had been dug for public servants in one of the other government departments. Law had taken careful note of the position of that trench because, by some bizarre aberration, the acting senior police officer in the town, First Class Sergeant Bridgeland, had specifically forbidden his policemen to dig slit trenches. Darwin, February 1942, and the head cop forbids the cops to dig a slit trench. Bridgeland had told them that if there was an air raid, they would all be on duty patrolling the town and they wouldn't need any slit trenches. Throughout the town, civilians were exposed because they had not bothered to dig trenches. But nothing was quite so reprehensible as this order forbidding men who knew that they needed trenches from digging them. As it was only by using the trenches that others had dug that at least 5 policemen were saved from certain death. As Law dived for the trench, he heard the whistle of a falling bomb, followed almost instantaneously by an almighty explosion. The bomb fell 10 metres from where he was lying, and dirt and rocks showered down on him as he lay, with his hands protecting the back of his head. For a few terrifying moments he couldn't breathe and he thought he'd been buried alive. But he managed to push his head clear through a metre of rubble, and for the rest of the road he stayed there, covered with dirt which he hoped would give him a little more protection. Through the dirt he could hear the planes screaming over the town, and behind him on the oval there was the constant hammering of machine guns from the anti-aircraft positions. As he gingerly lifted his head over the edge of the trench, he saw the ack-ack shells bursting behind, below, and to the side of the Japanese planes without ever seeming to touch them. Fair go, it was their first time shooting at a live target. In the next trench was another policeman, Sergeant Bill McKinnon, though Law didn't know it until he heard McKinnon call out to an old man called Charlie Clark, who lived in a cottage next to the police barracks, quote, "Are you all right, Charlie Clark?" unquote, the sergeant called, and from the direction of the cottage came a muffled reply, quote, "Yes, I'm okay," unquote. Charlie Clark had taken refuge under his kitchen table. McKinnon had sent his wife to Adelaide with Guinea Airways, paying for her ticket himself rather than wait for the government to evacuate her. He was now living at the police barracks, and his first action before going out of the trench had been to shake awake a constable who'd been on duty the night before. McKinnon, too, had been bitterly resentful of the order that prevented the police from digging trenches. He was watching the level bombers from the trench and saw the bombs fall away from the aircraft, quote, like soap bubbles, without first realising what they were. He watched them all the way to the ground and saw them explode somewhere near the administrator's residence, bracket, although the first run concentrated its attack on the harbour. One stick of bombs, probably released too early, fell between the Darwin Hotel and the police station. During a lull in the bombing, McKinnon walked briskly between what was left of the police barracks and the government offices, and then through the offices, calling out as he went, quote, "Is there anyone there?" unquote. The only reply came from a constable who had taken cover under a water tank behind the barracks. In the raid, the tank was blasted right off its stand and no trace of it was ever found. The constable had looked up to find that he was huddling under the open sky. Labourer James Kirban was due to go on the afternoon shift on the waterfront, and he was asleep in the Don Hotel where he lived when the raid started. In his subconscious he heard the bombs falling and thought it was a thunderstorm. He got up, washed leisurely, and as he looked out of the window he saw the post office blow up. He said later that his heart stopped beating. In his cottage behind the Victoria Hotel, another waterside worker, Joe Walker, was also in bed when he heard one of the sirens, which was just outside his window, begin its slow wind up to the full alarm. Walker, who was an assistant secretary of the North Australian Workers' Union, walked to the edge of his veranda but could see no aircraft, although he could hear the sound of bombs exploding and the anti-aircraft guns firing frantically. Debris was falling all the time on the tin roof of his cottage. When the dive bombers began screaming down over the harbour, he tried to take a few steps outside the cottage, but he was almost hit by the falling cases from the ack-ack ammunition, and he had to beat a hasty retreat. He stayed indoors until the raid seemed to be over, and then walked down towards the waterfront to see what had happened. As he passed some men in khaki wearing steel helmets, and they told him to go back and change out of his white shirt because it would be a good target for the Japanese if they returned. He thought the idea was daft, as he put it later, but he was in no mood for an argument, and, uncharacteristically for him, he did as he was told. There were few closer encounters with death than that of Thornton Hunter, who was a mess manager at one of the workmen's camps on East Point. Thornton was on his way to the hospital to have treatment for his leg in the outpatients department when there was an enormous explosion at the end of the hospital where the military patients were housed. He threw himself to the ground and bridged himself, keeping his stomach off the ground to lessen the effects of bomb blast. A shower of dirt and small stones poured down on him, but he was not injured. Thinking that it was now clear, he picked himself up, shook off the dirt, and had just started to walk towards the hospital when a Zero came after him. Hunter glanced over his shoulder and saw the fighter coming straight at him, flying at treetop height, its machine guns blazing. With bullets ripping up the ground all around him and whistling past his feet, he didn't know whether to stand or run. As the fighter roared over his head, he fancied he could see the pilot gesturing obscenely, a broad grin on his face. The hospital was severely attacked, but whether by mistake or for the Larrakia barracks, which it closely resembled from the air, or deliberately, was never clear. Certainly, between the aerial photographs being taken of the area by Japanese reconnaissance planes and the raid itself, the barracks was roughly camouflaged with sandbags piled 13 high all around it. From the altitude of the bombers, it would have been very easy to mistake the hospital for the now camouflaged barracks, and the red crosses, which were later claimed to have been conspicuously painted on the hospital roof, would have been invisible from 7,000 metres, 20,000 feet. You can't see what's painted on the roof. Fuchida afterwards said that it had never been his intention to bomb the hospital any more than he had ordered his pilots to attack a hospital ship which was anchored in the harbour. True or not, it was much less convincing to believe that the low-flying dive bombers and fighters were confused about their target, for they must have seen the red crosses on the ship. In his radio room at Fanny Bay, Lou Kernock heard the explosions that rocked Darwin 3 kilometres away, and a moment later the shock waves rattled the walls and the windows of the building. He punctiliously logged the time of the raid, 09:58, and breathed a sigh of relief that at least he'd given the town 20 minutes of warning. Next chapter is called The Attack on the Harbour, and that can be part 4. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Australia's greatest national day of shame, when Commissioner Abbott, with 2 B's and 2 T's, was in charge of the Northern Territory. Ciao.